Have you ever looked into the eyes of a wild animal and felt it was looking right back into your soul? It was the dead of winter, January 1994, in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. Snow piled high against pine trees, the air sharp enough to cut through wool, and the sun barely breaking over the ridgeline. Jack Simmons, 68 years old, stepped carefully through the knee-deep drifts behind his cabin. A retired forest ranger, Jack had lived out here alone for years, tucked away from a world that seemed to move too fast. Locals called him Bear Jack, half in jest, half in respect. He'd earned his name after decades of working in the woods, tending trails, rescuing hikers, and yes, occasionally crossing paths with the bears that roamed these parts. But today, something was different. As Jack rounded a bend near the old creek bed, a sound stopped him cold. A cry. Thin, desperate, almost human. Jack's sharp eyes scanned the underbrush, and there, tangled in the cruel metal bite of a poacher's snare, was a bear cub, no more than 7 months old. Its dark fur matted with snow, its paw raw and bleeding, the cub thrashed, snarled, and then froze as Jack approached. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs. For a moment, man and bear locked eyes, wild fear meeting quiet resolve. And then, like a whisper in the wind, a line came to Jack's mind. A line his late wife Martha used to say whenever he doubted the world. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. William Wordsworth. Jack took a slow breath. He knew the risks. A wounded wild animal was no pet. But the truth was, after all these years alone, Jack wasn't sure who needed saving more, the bear cub or himself. What Jack didn't know was that this moment, this choice, would awaken something in him he thought he'd lost long ago. And it would set into motion a story that no one in that small mountain town would ever forget. Jack crouched slowly, boots crunching in the snow, his breath puffing out in pale clouds. He raised his gloved hands in front of him, palms open, voice low and steady. "Easy, little fella. Easy now." The cub flinched, teeth bared in a soft growl, but exhaustion was winning over panic. Jack could see it. The way its body trembled, the sharp rise and fall of its chest. The snare was cinched tight around the front leg, biting into flesh. Whoever set this trap hadn't come back to check it. Maybe they'd forgotten. Maybe they didn't care, but Jack cared. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a worn multi-tool. His fingers fumbled a bit. Arthritis stiffened his knuckles these days, but the blade clicked open with a soft metallic snap. Jack murmured under his breath, eyes never leaving the cubs. "Martha always said I was stubborn. Well, girl, it looks like you were right." Kneeling just beyond the cub's reach, Jack worked quickly. He sliced through the tension wire, heart pounding as the cub flinched. A snap, a twang. The trap sprang loose. For a second, nothing happened. The cub froze. Jack froze. Then, in a blur of dark fur and snow, the bear scrambled backward, collapsing into the drift behind it. But it didn't run. It just lay there, panting, eyes glassy with pain and confusion. Jack felt a wave of something he hadn't known in years. Tenderness. Not pity, not fear, but a quiet, aching tenderness. He whispered, voice thick, "You're just a kid. You shouldn't be out here alone." Jack knew what he should do. Call fish and wildlife. Report the snare. Let the professionals handle it. But the nearest ranger station was over 2 hours away. And in this weather, they might not even get through till morning. Jack stood, hands on his hips, staring down at the trembling cub. He saw himself, in a way he couldn't explain. All the loneliness, all the loss, all the fierce will to survive packed into that small, wild body. "Well," Jack sighed, glancing up at the heavy gray sky, "looks like I've got company tonight." He slipped off his jacket, wrapping it around the bear as best he could, and lifted the cub into his arms with a grunt. The weight surprised him. Not heavy, but solid. Solid like life, solid like responsibility. As Jack trudged back toward his cabin, snow falling softly on his shoulders, a thought echoed in his mind. Not quite his own, but Martha's. As clear as if she were walking beside him. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. And as the cabin lights came into view, Jack realized something deep in his chest. This wasn't just about saving a wild animal. It was about saving a part of himself. The cabin door creaked open, spilling warm yellow light onto the snow. Jack stepped inside, boots heavy, breath tight in his chest. The cub, still swaddled in his old canvas jacket, let out a low, pained grunt. Jack gently set it down on an old wool blanket near the fireplace. The cabin was simple, a single room, stone hearth, wooden beams darkened by decades of wood smoke. On the mantel, a faded photo of Martha smiled out across the room. Jack caught himself glancing at it, almost as if asking permission. "Well, Martha," he murmured, "looks like we've got ourselves a guest." Jack worked quickly. Years in the field had taught him enough. Stop the bleeding, clean the wound, keep the animal warm and hydrated. He filled a shallow dish with water, broke out a first aid kit, and began cleaning the cub's leg. The animal twitched under his touch but didn't fight. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, the old man and the wild creature shared the kind of silence that only comes when two lives hang delicately in the balance. As the hours passed, Jack moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency. He spoke to the cub without thinking, his voice soft, a habit formed over years of solitude. "Jack, you know, I once got my own leg caught in a trap. Summer of '72. Wasn't pretty. Martha was the one who patched me up. She always said I had more grit than sense." He chuckled softly. "Jack, I can see she was right." He crushed a handful of aspirin, mixed it into honey water, and dabbed it onto the cub's lips. The bear licked weakly, its eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. By midnight, Jack was dozing in his old armchair by the fire, boots kicked off the cub softly snoring in its makeshift bed. But even as sleep tugged at him, something stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in years: purpose. Morning came harsh and bright. Sunlight glared off the snow, casting sharp white reflections through the frosted cabin window. The cub, Jack had started calling him Bruno after the great Saint Bernard Martha once wanted, was stirring, his head lifting slightly. Jack knelt beside him, one weathered hand running gently over the coarse fur. "Jack, you're a fighter, aren't you, Bruno?" "We both are." But as the day wore on, the weight of Jack's decision began to settle in. Around noon, his old friend and neighbor, Tom Bennett, came knocking. Jack opened the door to find Tom standing there, bundled in a red plaid coat, his face lined with cold and concern. "Tom, Jack, you all right? Heard a coyote howling last night. Figured I'd check in." Jack hesitated, then stepped aside. Tom's eyes widened. "Tom, Jack, is that a bear cub?" Jack nodded slowly. "Jack, found him in a snare yesterday." Tom let out a low whistle, running a gloved hand through his graying hair. "Tom? Jack, you can't just keep a wild bear in your cabin. You know that, right? Fish and wildlife will have your hide. And if the wrong folks hear about this..." Jack sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Jack, I know. But look at him, Tom. He's just a baby." Tom looked, and for a moment something softened in his expression. "Tom, you've got till tomorrow, Jack. Make the call." That night, as Jack sat by the fire, Bruno stirred again, restless, pawing at the edge of the blanket. His breathing was stronger, his eyes clearer. Jack watched, heart heavy. "Jack, you're getting better, aren't you, boy?" He leaned back, gaze drifting to the mantel, to Martha's photo. "And I'm getting attached." But Jack knew. Deep down, he knew. A wild animal wasn't meant for a human home. Bears weren't dogs or cats. They belonged to the forests, the mountains, the rivers. To keep Bruno was to betray the very thing Jack had loved his whole life, the untamed, unbroken spirit of nature. And yet, the thought of letting him go twisted like a blade in Jack's chest. The first real test came that night. A sharp knock rattled the cabin door. This time, not Tom, but two strangers. Men from town. Hunters Jack barely knew, their eyes sharp with suspicion. "Heard you've been harboring a bear, old man," one of them sneered. "You planning on raising yourself a pet, or maybe you're just losing it out here?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Jack, it's none of your concern." "Hunter too. It's everybody's concern when a wild animal gets tamed. Bears lose their fear of people. Next thing you know, someone's kid gets mauled." Jack stood tall, taller than they remembered him, his voice low and calm. "Jack, I'm handling it." They left with thin smiles, but Jack knew the message beneath their words. The clock was ticking. Late that night, as the fire died low, Jack sat alone, his hand resting on Bruno's flank. "Jack, Martha," he whispered to the quiet. "What am I supposed to do?" The answer came not in words, but in the rhythmic rise and fall of Bruno's breathing, the soft crackle of the hearth, the deep, endless silence of the mountains. Jack closed his eyes and knew. Loving nature meant knowing when to let go. By morning, Jack would have to make a choice. Keep Bruno and betray everything he stood for, or let him go and break his own heart. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. But sometimes, Jack thought, nature asks for more love than we think we can give. Morning came cold and sharp, the kind that slices through even the thickest flannel. Jack stood at the cabin window, mug of coffee in his hand, watching the gray light seep through the pine trees. His fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the day ahead. Behind him, on the blanket by the hearth, Bruno stirred. The cub's breathing was stronger now, the fever broken. Jack could see the life coming back into the little bear, the alert flicker of his ears, the testing flex of his injured paw. Jack whispered, more to himself than to Bruno, but his heart clenched at the thought. For 3 days, this wild creature had filled the silence of his life. Jack had found himself talking again. To the cub, to Martha's photo, even to the empty air. He hadn't realized how quiet his world had become until Bruno's soft growls and restless pawing filled it. We both know this isn't forever, Jack murmured, crouching beside the bear. You've got a whole world waiting for you out there, and I've got... His voice trailed off as his hand rested gently on Bruno's thick fur. I've got this cabin. He spent the morning preparing. He gathered supplies, thick gloves, a sturdy rope sling, a basket of food he'd set aside. Berries, fish, scraps from the freezer. He packed a small first aid kit, though his mind nagged that no kit could help in the wild. The forest beyond the cabin waited, vast and indifferent. Jack knew the exact place, the old creek bed where he'd found Bruno, a spot sheltered by rocks near fresh water, far from the roads and hunters' trails. As he worked, his mind drifted. He remembered Martha's laughter as they hiked these woods together. He remembered the countless sunrises, the silent snows, the way nature had held them both in its quiet, unshakable arms. And now, it was time to trust that same nature to hold this young life he had come to love. Jack lifted Bruno carefully into the sling. The cub was stronger, squirming a little, grumbling softly, but Jack's voice calmed him. Jack, shh. It's all right, Bruno. We're going home. The walk was slow, each step measured. Jack felt the strain in his back, the cold biting his cheeks, but he pressed on. He talked the whole way, as much for himself as for the bear. Jack, you know, I always thought I'd leave these woods before they left me. A soft chuckle. Jack, looks like you're the one heading out first. When they reached the clearing by the creek, Jack knelt and unwrapped the sling. Bruno sniffed the air, ears flicking. For a moment, the cub turned, pressing his nose against Jack's knee. Jack froze, heart squeezing in his chest. Jack, go on now, he whispered, voice rough with feeling. Go live. Bruno hesitated. Then, with a sudden burst of wild instinct, bounded toward the trees, pausing just once to glance back before disappearing into the underbrush. Jack sank onto a fallen log, watching the branches sway where the bear had passed. His throat tightened, his eyes stung, but deep down, beneath the ache, something stirred. A quiet knowing. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. It was true. He had saved a life, and in some small way it had saved him back. The woods were still. For a long time after Bruno disappeared, Jack remained on that fallen log, hands folded between his knees, eyes fixed on the empty space where the cub had last stood. Snowflakes drifted gently down, catching in his silver hair and melting on the thick wool of his coat. Well, Martha, Jack murmured, glancing toward the gray sky, I let him go. But as he sat there, a sharp crack in the trees snapped his head up. Voices, footsteps. And then, through the snow-frosted trees, the two hunters from town emerged, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes sharp with suspicion. Mick, well, look who we have here, one of them called out, smirking. Bear Jack, all alone. Jack stood slowly, his body stiff from the cold. Jack, you boys need something? We came looking. Heard you had yourself a pet. Figured we'd make sure the woods were safe. He's gone, back where he belongs. Yeah, and what happens when that cub wanders into someone's yard, huh? You think you're doing the right thing, old man, but you're just making it worse. Jack's heart pounded. He had known this was coming. He'd seen the looks in town, felt the whispers follow him down the grocery aisles. To them, he was the eccentric old ranger, harmless enough. Until now. Jack, he'll be fine. I raised animals like him my whole life. You leave him be. Mick took a slow step forward. Mick, here's the thing, Jack. You don't own these woods. And if that cub comes near my land, near my kids, I won't be asking questions. Jack met Mick's gaze unflinchingly. Jack, then you'll have to live with that. For a moment, the woods hung heavy with tension. 3 men, one unspoken threat. Then Mick let out a sharp laugh, turned on his heel and stomped back into the trees. Mick, crazy old fool, Jack heard him mutter. Jack stood there long after they left, his breath misting in the cold. The ache in his chest wasn't just from the confrontation. It was the slow realization that no matter how deeply he loved nature, the world outside didn't always understand. He began the long walk home, boots crunching through the crusted snow. Each step felt heavier. When the cabin came into sight, a fresh pain struck. Bruno's paw prints, clear in the snow, winding toward the tree line. Jack knelt by them, pressing his hand into the print. Jack, go far, little one. Far enough they'll never catch you. That night the storm hit. The wind roared through the pines, rattling the cabin's old windows. Jack sat by the fire, listening to the world rage outside, his thoughts circling like crows. He wondered if he'd done enough, if Bruno was strong enough, if the hunters were right, if maybe, just maybe, loving nature sometimes meant letting it face its own battles. The storm rattled the door. Jack rose, checked the lock, and paused. For the first time in years he felt small, not defeated, but humbled, reminded that even after decades in these woods, nature was still the greater force. Martha, he whispered to the fire, you always said these mountains would outlast us all. He closed his eyes, hearing the storm howl. You were right. Morning came with a strange quiet. The world outside was blanketed in white, the trees bowing under the weight of the snow. Jack stepped onto the porch, breathing deep the sharp, clean air. For a moment, he just stood there. Then, something moved. At the edge of the clearing just beyond the last pine, a dark shape, small, quick, gone. Jack's heart jumped. A part of him wanted to call out, to run after it. But he knew better. Instead, he smiled. A quiet, private smile. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. The words weren't a comfort. They were a truth that cost something. And standing there, hand resting on the porch rail, Jack felt both the ache of loss and the strange, fierce peace of having done what was right. The days passed slowly after the storm. Jack fell back into his routine, chopping wood, mending the fence, feeding the birds that flocked to his porch. But the cabin felt different now. The silence that had once been his comfort now pressed on him like a weight. Every morning, Jack walked to the edge of the clearing, eyes sweeping the tree line. He told himself he wasn't looking for Bruno, but deep down, he knew better. A week later, something changed. It was just before dawn when Jack woke to an odd sound outside. Not the usual whisper of wind or scratch of branches, but a soft, muffled huffing. Heart quickening, Jack slipped on his boots and stepped onto the porch. And there, at the edge of the trees, stood Bruno. Taller now, stronger, his dark coat glinting faintly in the pale morning light. The cub, no, not quite a cub anymore, stared at Jack for a long moment. Jack froze, breath held. Bruno gave a short, low grunt, almost like a farewell, then turned and vanished into the trees. Jack stood there a long while, the cold creeping through his clothes, a strange tightness in his chest. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice rough and thick. "Go on, live your life." And just like that, Bruno was gone, but not lost. Later that day, Jack sat by the fire, turning the old Wordsworth line over in his mind. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. It wasn't about control, he realized. It wasn't about taming or keeping or even saving. It was about trust. It was about standing at the edge of something wild and vast and beautiful, and choosing to love it anyway, even knowing it would leave, even knowing it might never look back. As evening fell, Jack walked to the old creek bed one last time. Snow crunched under his boots, the air sharp with the scent of pine and frost. At the spot where he had first found Bruno, he crouched and touched the earth. "Thank you," he murmured, to the woods, to the wind, to the life that had brushed against his own, however briefly. As he stood and turned for home, the last light of day spilled gold across the snow. And for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel alone. Spring came late that year. The last of the snow melted slowly, dripping from the cabin's eaves, soaking the forest floor until tiny shoots of green began pushing through the earth. Jack watched it all unfold from his porch, wrapped in his old wool coat, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. Life had a way of moving forward whether you were ready or not. Every so often, Jack would wander down to the old creek bed. He'd look for signs, broken branches, fresh tracks, claw marks on a birch. Sometimes he thought he heard the faint rustle of movement deeper in the trees, but he never followed it. He didn't have to, because Jack knew. Bruno was out there, alive, growing, finding his place in a world where only the strong and the wild survived. And Jack? Well, Jack had found his place too. Not in taming the wilderness, but in belonging to it, in trusting it, in knowing that what we love most deeply is never really ours to keep, but ours to cherish for as long as we're allowed. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and violet behind the mountains, Jack stood by the fence, his hands resting on the weathered wood. He looked out at the endless sweep of forest and whispered into the quiet, "Goodbye, Bruno. Thank you." For a moment, the wind seemed to carry something back, the faintest echo of a huff, a rustle in the underbrush. Or maybe it was just the sound of the world turning on, and on, and on. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Wordsworth's line, once just poetry, now felt like a truth Jack had lived. And maybe that's the lesson waiting for all of us. To love without possession, to care without control, to give something, or someone, the freedom to become what they were meant to be. Because in the end, nature teaches us the hardest and most beautiful truth of all. Letting go is not the same as losing. If you were Jack, what would you have done? Have you ever had to let go of something you loved, trusting it would find its own way? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, so you'll never miss another tale of resilience, courage, and the quiet lessons nature has to offer.